Hi, it's so great to be here. This might be shorter than half an hour, we'll see. But yes, my name's Emma, and I've been working with the Jesuits in London for 8 years now. Pray As You Go has been going as an app for, well, it's been going as a podcast for 17 years, which is mad. So we're coming up on our 20th anniversary. And it's just been such a life-giving and joy-bringing thing for me. So it's great to be able to share the spirituality with you today. And the session is called Finding God in All Things. So if you're familiar with Ignatian spirituality, you're going to cringe about this, because every Ignatian talk is called Finding God in All Things. I like to refer to it instead as recognizing God in all things, or discovering God in all things. But if you are very familiar with it, there's still time to leave, no judgment. But hopefully there'll be something refreshing in it, and there's a great Ignatian thing about repetition and savouring something and coming back to something again. So we'll be doing a bit of that today. We're going to pause from time to time and just have little bits of reflection, unpacking a bit of Ignatian spirituality in half an hour, a bit of discernment, but we're really going to zoom in on the Examen prayer today, which again, loads of you will probably be really familiar with it. But at the end, I'm going to guide us in one as well. So at least you get a bit of a prayer session. So that will be great, hopefully. So the only thing I really ask of you for this talk is this will sound awful, but to pay attention. And I don't mean to me, so you're released of that burden. Don't pay attention to me. Pay attention to what's going on inside you and notice the inner movements. Just notice what stirs you, what draws you, what stays with you, or what you sort of have an aversion to a little bit. So just as we begin, we'll start with the first kind of pausey bit. I just want us to take a second to think about our own prayer lives, which you've probably spent all day doing, but here's another space to do it. And within that, just without judgment, just hold your prayer life before God and just have a think and a reflect about where it's at and be gentle with it, and maybe towards what God might be calling of you. And after that, I'm going to read a little quote from Karl Rahner, which should hopefully lift us. So just take 20 to 30 seconds just to hold your prayer life before God. O everyday prayer, you are poor and a little tattered, and the worse for wear, like the everyday itself. You are the prayer of loyalty and reliability, the prayer of the selfless. You are the dedication which makes the grey hours light and the trivial moments great. You are the prayer of the poor but loyal heart that laboriously and honestly, in spite of all the weakness, weariness, and inner discontent, is at least continuing to dig a small shaft through which a small ray of the eternal light falls into our heart that is buried by the everyday. So wherever you find your prayer life today, whether it's buried by the everyday, might be flourishing or thriving, can use this time to reflect and flourish and grow in your prayer life, hopefully. So I'm just going to gently move us into reflecting on Ignatian spirituality. And again, whatever you think of your prayer life, St. Ignatius was originally not a great man of prayer, believe it or not. Most of you probably know he was a nobleman, born in Spain to quite a noble family. He was a bit of a ladies' man, shall we say, and he was kind of an amazing soldier. But he had a lot of ambition. He sort of wanted all the women, wanted to be a great soldier. But then his kind of dreams came crashing down in 1521. He was hit by a cannonball, which shattered his leg and shattered his dreams in the process. And he had to go into convalescence for a whole year. A time of no technology, he was in bed for a year, just nothing, except the Bible and some books on the lives of the saints. And as he was reading these, in a very St. Ignatius way, he thought, I can be the best saint, the best, the absolute best. So that for me is always an interesting segue of the man he was and the man he was going to become. And after whilst he was convalescing, he really took time to begin noticing his daydreams. He was a big daydreamer. He's quite an emotional guy. And he would have daydreams about becoming the best soldier in the world and winning a particular girl, for example. But he noticed within that, he noticed within himself that left him feeling quite deadened. And it didn't bring him a lot of life. And there wasn't a lasting sense of hope or anything. But when he reflected and sort of had these daydreams about following Christ, becoming a soldier for Christ, giving money to the poor, giving away all his possessions, even though those are hard things, he was left with such an inner peace and a movement towards hope. He then sort of went to a cave and had quite a miserable time for a month, which was difficult. But what came out of it was what we call the full spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which I had the chance to do last year. And it's a 30-day silent prayer journey that's accompanied, and it's a compilation of various spiritual exercises, contemplation, using imagination, Lectio Divina, all kinds of things. And today we'll zoom in on the Examen, which comes out very much out of that daydreaming thing that I was talking about. So just hold that in your mind, imagining St. Ignatius in his daydreaming bed whilst healing. It's worth noting that Ignatius did not come up with the Examen or Lectio Divina. He sort of borrowed for Jesus, which I think is okay, and developed it over the years. So that was wonderful. The next thing I just want to touch on in our prayer lives is discernment. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing that most people would have immediately thought about decision-making. And discernment's great for decision-making, but it is not decision-making in itself. I think at all moments, every time, we are ourselves discerning, even when we don't recognise it. We're being pulled in one way or another. We're being drawn in different ways to different things. And essentially what Ignatius encourages us to do, and Ignatian spirituality, is to recognise the movements of the Holy Spirit in our lives, to notice how and where God might be drawing us, and then to kind of move and act in that direction, hence decision-making. And with this, it's often to do in our prayer lives with competing voices. So when I think about this, think about the verse from the Gospel of John, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." So we're sort of after that voice of God and trying to sift through things. So discernment, in a way, is an act of prayer. It's something we do to recognise that voice of God. It's a sifting and a weighing of the voices. And these voices are present in our thoughts, our feelings, experiences, events, conversations that we have. We're doing this at all times. It's an act of prayer. And Ignatius referred to these as the good spirit, the Holy Spirit, and the bad spirit. We'll start with the good. So the good spirit is the voice of good spirit in prayer. It indicates and moves us towards what Ignatius called consolation. So again, I just want you to think of a time, could be many times, where you've been more drawn towards God and spent time in God's presence. And just maybe choose a word that you would associate with that. It might be peace or it might be hope. Anyone's brave enough to share their word. I'm very good with silence, so if no one says anything, I did a whole thing last year in silence, and I also have my own list. But if anyone's brave enough to share a word, shout it out.
Wisdom.
Wisdom.
Joy.
Joy.
Gratitude.
Gratitude. I didn't hear quite.
Clarity.
Clarity. That's a great one.
Love.
Love.
Intimacy.
Intimacy. So those are great examples for being in a state of consolation, for hearing the voice of the good spirit would be associated with that. Margaret Silf has a great example of consolation. She talks about it as directing our focus beyond and outside ourselves, lifting our hearts so that we can see the joys and the sorrows of other people. Consolation bonds us with community as well. It generates and inspires new ideas, restores our balance, refreshes our inner vision. And it shows us really clearly, as you were saying, with clarity, where God is active in our lives, where God is leading us. Ignatius sort of summed this up with one of my favourite quotes by him, where he says, "Whatever you're doing, that which makes you feel most alive, that is where God is." So it's kind of moving to where you feel most alive. If you sense that in something, God is probably there. So conversely, we move on to the slightly more difficult one, the bad spirit. I often come back to, again, another verse from John's Gospel for this. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. So the voice of the bad spirit sort of often distorting things that might be true, but lots of distortion. And there's more of a sort of restricted sense in this place to what Ignatius called desolation. So similarly, if you can think of a time where you've perhaps been in desolation in prayer, where it's not quite going so well, it might be you might feel sadness or anxiety or despair. I don't know if anyone else has got any words that they'd like to share on that one. Enslavement, yeah. Fear, division. Confused. Restless. Isolation. Darkness. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed, but there were quicker and more words for that one, which every time we do this exercise, that's the same everywhere. So I'm always prepared for that one to have more. But those were really good words. It's a feeling of spiraling down. Margaret Silf, again, she says, it turns us in on ourselves. It drives us to spiral deeper into negativity. It cuts us off from others. Makes us want to give up on things that used to be important to us. Takes over our whole consciousness. It crowds out our distant vision and covers up any landmarks, any memories that we have of God moving us in the past. And it drains us of energy. Someone I work with, when we have to make big decisions, will often sit there and she'll say, what is it that the bad spirit wants of us? Let's do the opposite. So we get to do that as an exercise, and actually it's not comfortable, but it's very helpful to sort of know, well, the bad spirit would want us to argue, would want lots of despair, would want us to be dragged down, that kind of thing. So hopefully, as you've been noticing and paying attention, you might like to ponder for a second just where you recognise the voice of the good spirit and the bad spirit in your life at the moment, perhaps in your prayer times, or perhaps just more generally. So I'll just give you a moment to reflect on that, and you might want to write something down. And that is a question to take with you maybe for the end of this session as well. So what does this all mean as we live out our daily lives? From someone called Saint Ignatius to good spirit and bad spirit and all kinds of things. But the Examen prayer is a great way to put discernment into action and practice. I mean, how many people currently use some form of Examen prayer at the end of the day or whenever? That's great. That's a good show. Okay, that's great. Well, it's amazing. And it's hugely important. And St. Ignatius and many others over the centuries have said, even if your entire prayer life collapses, never let the Examen collapse, because that's where you'll find God present and working. So it's really important. And I learned this the hard way when I did the 30-day exercises last year. Before you go in, they give you some advice, and they said, do the Examen every day, and you absolutely should. And you're praying for 4 or 5 hours a day anyway. So by the end of the day, I was really done in some ways. I was very tired, and I sort of didn't let it happen, and I thought it wasn't that important. And on one of the repose days I had, I sort of read a bit of the exercises and accidentally stumbled across Ignatius's instructions about the Examen during the exercises, saying it was the most important thing in the exercises. You have to do it 2 or 3 times a day, including your prayer times. And I panicked and thought I'd failed the whole thing and I'm going to have to start again and I've done it wrong. And I brought it to my retreat director, who said, why don't we just start from now? I was like, okay. It was like day 23, so... but it was fine, but actually it ended up being the best week of the exercises because it turns out it is the most important thing, not just for what the material you're praying with, but the things that are happening around you, the interactions you're having in silence, the food, everything. God is moving not just in the actual prayer moments themselves. So the Examen is a form of review. Most people say it's reviewing your day, but actually it's reviewing any period of time. It could be an event, it could just be a moment. I'm going to get you to review the morning in a little bit. But it's where to recognise for that voice of God, for that good spirit and that bad spirit. And I just can't stress how good it is enough. And it doesn't have to be long. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 10, 20. You could even review a conversation you've had with someone. We use it a lot with the Jesuits. After we've had a meeting, we'll sort of do a small Examen on what's staying with us and what we've heard. It's guided by the Holy Spirit as well. So when you enter into an Examen, you're asking first for God to be present and to move you and to draw you. And I often think the sign of a good Examen prayer is when something surprising comes up that you'd completely forgotten about from the day or the period of time that you're praying with. It's a real sign of God moving. To go a little bit deeper into finding God in all things in this way, there's a prayer in the exercises called the Contemplatio, which has a terrible name in English. It's the contemplation to attain love. But again, I prefer the contemplation to recognise love. And it's actually an Examen you do of your entire life, of God's grace and gifts to you, starting from your very creation, the very time that he's made you, and everything he gives you from that moment, your parents or your friends, or really anything you've received in your life, you suddenly recognise it as this amazing gift from God, even if it's a very small thing. And the second step to this prayer is recognising God in nature. And Ignatius invites us to become aware of the workings and movements of God in plants and animals. And for me, it was a very odd, you can't unsee it moment in terms of spirituality. That each living thing is called to announce the presence of God. Each animal is ordained and is moving and living and having its being because God calls it to. So even in prayer, you can notice movements towards consolation just by looking at a plant. It's amazing. Perhaps a good example of this is Saint Therese of Lisieux, who loved nature and its intricacies, and often used nature as an example of God's kindness and activity. And in some ways, she was a kind of lived example of noticing all the little things about God that's active in the world. So in London life, when I'm overwhelmed, I'll often just go and look for a tree and just stand there and remember that this tree is alive because God is willing it to be so, and that it is made with love and attention. And it's a sign of God's working presence. So we can engage in this continually. And we'll practice an examen in a second, just to finish. For a review of the morning. It's worth noting that the more that we practice the examen, perhaps at the end of a day or the end of an event, the more actually we start to do it live time, in real time, where you sort of walk out of a room or you have a conversation, you start noticing movements. So the practice of the examen after the fact becomes an immediate thing you do in daily life. Brother Lawrence, who's famous for the practice of the presence of God, said, there is not in the world a way of life more sweet or more delightful than a continual conversation with God. And I think that is the beauty of the examen. So the format of the examen is normally you sort of give thanks and come into the presence of God. You ask for God to enlighten you, to show you where God has been at work and present. You examine the day. You sort of let the day sweep over you, or the period of time that you're examining. And you just let come to the service naturally. We're not forcing anything or trying to remember, or if you think you've really enjoyed a moment in your day and you think, I want to go back and reflect on that, try and avoid that. Just let whatever come up naturally, and be looking for those moments of consolation and desolation. We often seek forgiveness in the examen. So we look at the harder times where maybe we were moved in a direction of desolation and acted on it. And then finally, we resolve to change. We decide perhaps a behaviour or attitude that we will move against or towards the following day, and we ask God for the grace that we might need to do that. So I'd like to just finish by guiding you in an examen of the day that you've just had. So we'll do this in silence. I'm obviously not going to ask for anyone to share anything that's being prayed. But you might just want to take a moment to just get settled and still. And just take a moment to recognize that you're here with the Lord. And become still before God. And just feel the warmth of God's love as God looks at you. You can bask in that experience, that the God of love is inviting you at this moment into an ever deeper relationship of love. With this loving God, think a bit about the day that has been so far. How were you feeling when you woke up? Perhaps your journey, a time during Mass today. Any of the other sessions. The conversations with people. Just Just let your mind sweep over the events of the day, asking God to reveal to you what God would like you to pray with. From all that you've noticed, from everything that's emerged naturally, you might like to think now, what in this day am I thankful for? Where have I noticed movements, feelings, thoughts that draw me towards God? Where have I felt more alive or uplifted? What are the moments that come to mind that have been received as a gift, that lead me to say thank you to God? Have there been moments where I struggled or felt myself in a downward spiral? Perhaps something that weighed me down. I ask God to help me notice how I can be drawn back closer to God. What in this day might I be sorry for? Have there been moments when I did not manage to be Jesus' hands, feet, eyes, love, his compassion for the people around me? Perhaps I was short with someone or irritated or unkind in some way. I take a moment to say sorry to God. I ask God to nudge me if there was something God was trying to tell me today when I wasn't paying attention. I ask for my eyes to be open to anything unfinished. And finally, as I look towards tomorrow, what do I want to pray for? Particular people or events? What graces do I need to ask for in order to stay close to God in all my activity? we draw that time of prayer to a close by saying a glory be together. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So that's an examen. And drawing it back to what you thought about your prayer life at the beginning, you might want to rethink it now, do an examen of your prayer life from this place, and just ponder where God might be moving you towards in your prayer life. So thank you for this.